Welcome to the Den of Dissent. This is a show where we challenge the current culture and mainstream talking points of the day. What is the news telling us? What is the culture telling us? Where is our civilization headed? And by what standard do we judge these issues? Do you agree or do you dissent? Let's find out.
That was what the NATO-Russia Council was. That was Bill Clinton spitting in Vladimir Putin, pardon me, I said Putin a minute ago too. I meant Boris Yeltsin. That's him spitting in Boris Yeltsin's face and saying, this is the best that you're ever going to get from us, and you're going to have to like it.
Yeah.
Which was just not what I thought was happening at the time. But now in my recent book and in the research that I've clearly shown in my book that I've now written in my mid to late 40s, that I was wrong in my 20s. This is what was really going on. Was the building of the American empire. And after all, you know what? Forget Iraq. I should have been over it when Bill Clinton did the Serbia war of 1999. He didn't use the United Nations to do that. He did that over Russia's dead body. And they would have absolutely vetoed it if he'd taken it to the UN Security Council. So he just did it anyway. You know what he did? He worked with Tony Blair. They called it the coalition of the willing. And they just launched the war anyway.
Yeah.
Right? So now I should have known right then and there. Okay, I'm sorry. There's no way in the world that if we really are on this path of this grand design world government agenda, that breaking Kosovo away from Serbia would outrank in importance our building this world state with Russia, right? It's just clearly not. They had already decided, screw the Russians. They're never going to join us, but they're too weak to do anything about it. We don't have to suffer their opinions and listen to their crap. We can do whatever we want. As George H.W. Bush had said, the real world law, the real new world order is what we say goes.
Yeah.
Not America's destroyed and replaced with a world federal government run out of Beijing or some crap, right? We are the world government. That's the new world order.
That would be an interesting debate for you to have with like a Bircher, like a veteran Bircher. Because I mean, you know, for most of my life, I would say I always believed in the grand design.
Well, Will Grigg was with me, so I think I win.
What's that?
Right? Will Grigg was with me on this.
Yeah.
So
very true.
Yeah, if the editor of the New American magazine came to my same way of thinking about all this, and after all, look at us. It's 2025. Does anybody think that America's building a world state with Vladimir Putin and Chairman Xi Jinping right now? Is that what we're doing? Somebody let Vladimir Putin know that he's part of a conspiracy to build a one world government to rule over the United States of America. I'm sure he'll be extremely impressed to find out, you know?
Yeah. Well, you know, earlier you touched on Israel. So you were talking about, I think you mentioned Richard Pearl. So before we get into Israel, I really, you know, that's the elephant in the room today. Well, it has been for a while. Well, let me start off saying this. I'm Christian. I go to church on a regular basis. For years, you know, I grew up, I would say when 9/11 happened, that's when I really got into politics. I was going to, you know, church as well. And I was taught a certain way, support Israel, stand with Israel. But I never really questioned what that meant. What does support and stand with Israel mean? How do you do that? How do you support Israel? And so even today, when you hear about the critiques of Israel and Netanyahu, sometimes you get labeled as a liberal. Sometimes you get labeled the response is, well, you're going against God's people. You're going against what God's word says. Yeah. So for Christians, right, that are listening to this and read your articles, your books, and so forth, because a lot of Christians, they don't know. They're not getting solid information on Israel, the government of Israel. Mm-hmm. Give me some of your critiques of Israel. What crimes has Israel committed? And I'm asking that because I got into a conversation recently regarding the whole October 7th thing and the ceasefire situation.
It's a mess, all right. Well, look, and first of all, before I do that, let me say that, and I really should have said this before, I have nothing but respect for the population of the John Birch Society. I mean, these are patriotic Americans. They are, you know, firm believers in George Washington's Constitution and preserving this republic. They have always been good, conservative, patriotic folk. the fact that I disagree with the New World Order conspiracy thing overall should not be like read as me diminishing the New American, their audience, those people. I've done numerous interviews with their magazine recently, and I've met the population of the Birch Society here in Texas numerous times, mostly in the past, but they stuck up for the Branch Davidians. They told the truth about the Oklahoma City bombing. They opposed the war on terrorism before it ever started. And as soon as it did, William Norman Grigg wrote a piece right after September 11th applying St. Thomas Aquinas's just war theory and said, we're not even allowed to attack Afghanistan because of our Christian faith,
Mm.
because we should be negotiating over bin Laden, not fighting the Taliban regime in Kabul. They said that, I mean, these are right wing, conservative, Christian, patriotic folk. If they vote Republican. And they said, Jesus outranks Congress. And under our religion, it is not okay to go off angry now, killing innocent people. No. And they said that before 2001 was over. They deserve so much credit for that. And
Yeah.
that's because Will Grigg was driving the car, by the way. And I don't know who all he was up against there, but I know that he was the one who was calling those shots and doing the right thing and will never be forgotten for that.
Right.
Um, so as long as I'm disagreeing, I want to make sure that it's clear that I have nothing but respect for these people. They're
Gotcha.
good people. And now, look, as far as the religious stuff, like I have to leave that part to you. I'm not a religious guy.
Hmm.
I'm not. It's hard for me to say, like, hey, man, you're interpreting your own religion wrong or whatever. When like I only like page 16, I don't like what it says on page 17, or I read it different than you read it. I'm gonna have to let you and
Right.
your people argue about that. But I can tell you that from my point of view, that from everything that I understand of the religion of Christianity, there's nothing mandated by Jesus or by St. Paul or whoever that says that modern day Christians have to support the modern day state of Israel. That seems to me to be just completely a misunderstanding of the situation and of the scriptures and potentially even deliberately. I mean, the Schofield Bible was those all those notes in red in the margins of your King James Bible, those were all added in the 19th century, right? Mr. Richard, I think it was Richard Schofield. He was not one of the disciples. He came from essentially our modern era, certainly compared to the era of the Bible, and just added his interpretation on there and said, "Oh, you know what they mean by this? They mean do whatever the Zionists say." But that's just there's no reason to have faith in Mr. Schofield and his interpretation. All of that should be, you know, at least subject to review and scrutiny. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? Ted Cruz said to Tucker Carlson, he goes, "But my Sunday school teacher told me." Well, look, your Sunday school teacher was very impressive when she was 42 and you were 7, right? But that doesn't mean that she actually knew anything, right? Your Sunday school teacher is just your friend Jimmy's mom, and she's actually maybe she's kind of smart, but maybe she doesn't really know what the inspired word of God truly was, how it was meant to be interpreted in these particular circumstances. You got to at least be open to that kind of thing in a way that Ted Cruz is not. And I'll tell you that I have given speeches about Israel where I talk about the actual Israel and
Right.
where I have people come up to me and say, wow, I actually have only really learned about Israel in church. The only Israel that I know is the one that my Sunday school teacher taught me about.
Right.
I don't know really anything about the modern state of Israel created after 1948 or the people who run it or anything actually about it. I have kind of this whole other Israel in my mind, which to me, when I was a kid growing up, the only Israel I ever really knew about was in the Christmas song, Born is the King of Israel. Otherwise, they never really talk about it. What difference does it make? It's a tiny little country over there. They don't have any oil. They cause us a lot of grief, but they don't actually do anything for us. So, like, they were never really part of the discussion compared to, say, like England or France or Mexico or other countries that we deal with. They're essentially a non-issue. And when I was growing up, as far as I knew, nobody ever told me about the enormous influence that they played, for example, in helping encourage America to do Iraq War One. And certainly there were a lot of people, especially younger than me, who had no idea about their role in lying us into Iraq War Two in 2003. And people said, if that war was for Israel. And then other people said that war was for oil, when the answer was that war was for oil for Israel. That war was not for the United States at all. Richard Pearl is a foreign spy. He and Paul Wolfowitz and David Wormser and Douglas Feith and Scooter Libby, they were serving the interests of Ariel Sharon's Likud party and Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party. And it was really Netanyahu more than Sharon that wanted America to go after Iraq, which after all is what W. Bush wanted to do for his own purposes anyway. And they had this plan, which was a harebrained idiot scheme that said that if they could get rid of Saddam Hussein and put the Shiite supermajority of Iraq in power there, that Shiite supermajority would then be totally compliant with American goals, and they would do whatever they're ordered to by the Hashemite king of Jordan or his cousin, or failing that, Ahmed Chalabi, their swindler, con artist, spy who helped lie us into war, helped come up with all the lies about the weapons of mass destruction to get us into that war, that they'll control the Shiites and they'll be compliant and they will force Hezbollah in southern Lebanon to start being nice to Israel and they'll help to lead to a regime change in Iran and all these things. It was completely harebrained, idiot, stupid thinking on the part of the neocons. And all Iraq War II did, as everybody understands now, is put Iran's best friends in power in Baghdad. That 8-year civil war that we fought there, we fought for our regional rivals, the Iranians, against our deadly enemies, the bin Ladenites, on the Sunni side, leading the Sunni insurgency there. And all of that was for the interests of Israel. None of that was for the American people. And 4,500 American soldiers and Marines, airmen and guardsmen were killed in that thing. On top of that, probably another 5,000 contractors, tens of thousands wounded, and the Iraqis were completely destroyed their nation. 1 million people killed in the Civil War, their entire infrastructure, completely decimated, had to start basically from zero again. And all for the cynical goals of a bunch of treacherous foreign agents. And then how the Israelis act, since creating the state there. Here's another thing I learned about Israel as a kid, I guess probably in government school. They taught us this slogan I'm sure you've heard before, that Israel was created over there in the Eastern Mediterranean where nobody lived. It was a land without people for a people without land. And so what a great coincidence that just as millions of refugees from World War II are seeking to create a new Jewish homeland on the Eastern Mediterranean shore, that, hey, somehow the Eastern Mediterranean shore wasn't settled and no one lived there and they could just plop themselves right down and create a state. But of course, that was a lie. They had to completely cleanse 750,000 people off of their land in order to create their new Jewish state there. And then it was a conspiracy theory that there was such a thing as a Palestinian refugee who'd been driven off of their land. I mean, 750,000 people. You're talking about the greater metro Austin area. You're talking about a massive pogrom where these people were cleansed from their land, forced from their homes. And then they made a secret deal with the king of Jordan that he would take the West Bank of the Jordan River. And then I don't know if this was a secret deal or just the result, they ended up making a deal with the Egyptians at the end of the War of 48 that they would take control of the Gaza Strip in order so that the Palestinians could not have a state of their own, like in the deal. People go, oh, well, the United Nations recommended. Well, there's a few handpicked puppets of the United States in the brand new United Nations General Assembly that, of course, has no authority whatsoever to take a country away from one group of people and give it to another. And everybody always invokes this as though this is like holy writ or something from on high. And then, but meanwhile, what did that recommendation say? It said the Palestinians should get a state too. But
Mm.
no, they did not do that. They thwarted that by Golda Meir made a secret deal with the king of Jordan to prevent that from happening. And then what they did by cleansing the land, they created a state that was 80-20, super duper majority Jewish, so that they could claim that they're a democratic state and part of the West. And 1/5 of the population was Palestinian, Muslim, and Christian, and they live as second or even third class citizens, but have citizenship within the Israeli state, even though their representation in the government is very limited because by tradition, they're never allowed to be part of the ruling coalition, with only one exception a few years ago. But for the entire history of Israel, they were never allowed to be in the government, only in the parliament, but never part of the executive. Um, but then what happened was in the 67 war, which Israel started, and launched what they, like George W. Bush would claim, a preemptive war against the Egyptians who were not preparing to attack them. But they attacked Egypt, and then Syria and Jordan both jumped in as well. And with America's rearmament, Israel beat all three of them. And in doing so, they took control of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And in doing so, then they took possession of millions of people. And unlike in 1948, they were not able to cleanse the territory of all the Palestinians. They kidnapped them all, essentially.
They
And then,
kidnapped the settlers or the
well, no, the
inhabitants?
Palestinians, then, yeah, the settlers, the Israelis are the settlers. The
Right, right.
Palestinians are the ones who are from there. So essentially, in other words, when they took this land, instead of removing all the people, they took the land and kept all the people. It was politically impossible for them to do a massive ethnic cleansing campaign. But then, so what that meant was they took control of millions of people that they hate and want nothing to do with. They don't even want them as slaves. They just want them dead. They want to kill them and steal their land. They don't want them, and they've held them essentially in total bondage since 1967. So, for now, almost 60 years and longer, far longer than the Soviets occupied Eastern Europe. And the Palestinians live, when they're not being completely bombarded like we've seen in Gaza over the last 2 years, they live under a totalitarian foreign government's military martial law, like in the West Bank. They have no rights. They have no, what we call civil rights or civil liberties, no protections whatsoever, no representation in the government that rules over them. They are in prison, essentially, in a concentration camp. On the West Bank, they call it like a minimum security prison, where they have essentially, you know, kind of minor home rule, in the sense that, like, trustees in the Israeli prison
Mhm.
camp run the place, the Palestinian Authority. On the West Bank, rather than the trustees in the prison, it's Hamas, who are basically like the strongest gang in the prison, who took over the prison when the Israelis withdrew to the outer walls and just put the place under siege. But
So
the Palestinian people live in a worse state of slavery and bondage and cruelty from their overlords than any other people anywhere in the world. There's just nothing like their situation, and their only crime is being born not Jewish on land that the Israelis want to steal from them. It's as simple as that.
so some people, I mean, the argument that I hear a lot, especially from Christians, is that Israel is the victim and Israel is being attacked, and this is why you see the backlash against Palestinians and so forth. Is that
Right.
Israel was
I
was
would say that those people, they have to know that that makes no sense. I mean, if I told you that, yeah, okay, the Americans, the white European colonizers, yes, they almost entirely eradicated the American Indians from the middle part of this continent. But you have to understand, the Indians started it every time. All they did was ambush the poor, innocent Anglo settlers, who all they wanted to do was just grow some crops in peace. But those damn Sioux, they were just so relentless that they had to be exterminated. Them and the Lakota and everybody else. You would understand that. Yeah, no, actually, the people who were settling the land and driving the indigenous people off of their land, they were the aggressors. Now, does that mean that the Indians always fought by the most honorable rules and only killed fighting aged males in battle while armed? No. In fact, they committed atrocities against women and children, much like Hamas would do in their same situation. But is it how preposterous would it be if I just told you that? Listen, the Europeans, yes, they killed a lot of Indians, but it was self-defense every time. And the Indians, well, their problem was they're just terrorists. And they liked using terror to terrorize people because of what fun it is to be a terrorist. It
Mm.
wasn't that they were being driven off of their land, that their women and children were being killed, that their homes were being burned, that anything was happening to them that they were fighting with defensive force against. Oh, no. And you know how you can tell? Look at me. I'm an Anglo. That's how I know. See? And I mean, that's completely stupid. Same thing here. You take millions of Europeans, you put them on land that belongs to other people, commit absolutely unlimited cruelties against them, including butchering their women and children. And then when they resist, you go, oh, well, they're Muslim terrorists because you know how Muslim Arab terrorists are. Give me a break, dude. That makes no sense at all. Look at the map and look at who's occupying who. It's not that the Palestinians have rounded up all of the Israeli Jews and locked them in concentration camps. It is, in fact, the other way around. That's why we call October the 7th, because it was over by supper time. They broke out of their prison camp for a few hours, and then they
Mm.
were rounded right back up into it again. And then the Israelis had total freedom of action to bomb the place for 2 years. Have you ever seen a situation where one side is oppressing the other, but the other has total air superiority over the first side?
Yeah.
Be
Let's
honest with yourselves, people, please.
I think it has a lot to do with the sources of information that people are going to. And also, like I said, as a Christian, when you're reading the Bible a certain way, and so you hold the Bible in a high regard, and then you're being taught about the scripture in a certain way as well. So then if there's anything wrong that you see with Israel, sometimes people feel like, well, I can't critique Israel because, I'm a Christian and I have to have blind loyalty. But, there are Christians that do critique. On the subject of October 7th, I want to go back to Hamas because I think you have this Israel starter pack that I read a little bit about through
Mhm.
Twitter, and it mentions how Israel, or the government of Israel, Netanyahu, supported Hamas. Now you say that this wasn't he didn't design Hamas or anything like that,
Right.
but he propped up Hamas. Can you talk about how Netanyahu supported Hamas and why he would do something like that?
Yes. Now, there's a limited hangout explanation, which is, oh, well, geez, they're in charge of the strip. So we just had to give them some money, for humanitarian aid. And you'd be mad at us if we didn't. That's such a lie and a cop out. That's not what's going on at all. And in fact, let's rewind a little bit to before Netanyahu's time. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was the Israeli Mossad and Shin Bet who helped to create Hamas and helped to abet its rise. Now, it was created by the Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, and but it was originally a charity, basically, feeding kids in the morning and getting them to school and this kind of thing. And they were built up to be a militia. And what the Israelis did was one, finance them, and then two, marginalize all their opposition on the Gaza Strip. This is again in the late 1980s. So whoever was kind of the competition for Hamas, they would find themselves all locked up in jail while Hamas was allowed to go free and keep their weapons and things like this. And the reason they did this was to create a right-wing religious alternative to the PLO of Yasser Arafat. Now, Arafat was sort of like kind of half commie, half nationalist, secularist 20th century type. And they said, well, I mean, they're all Sunni Muslims. So they said, what we'll do is we'll try to foment the reintroduction of fundamentalist Sunni Islam to divide and conquer the Palestinians by dividing their loyalty to their civil authority. Are you loyal to Fatah or are you loyal to this new group? And so they helped to abet the rise of Hamas in the first place. And you can read that in right wing publications like the Wall Street Journal. There's an article by Andrew Higgins, and there's a really great article by Richard Sale in UPI. UPI, that's the Washington Times, very close to the Reaganites and the Republicans, always were, right? Richard Sale is no commie, pinko, liberal, lefty, anything. This is a conservative guy. You can see in his article, all of his sourcing is CIA and Israeli intelligence are telling him this is true. Okay. And you read all about that. And I have all the sources in an article. If people want to look deeply into this, there's an article that I wrote with Connor Freeman. It's called Netanyahu's Support for Hamas Backfired. And I have all the links. We go through all the history and I have all the citations so you can do a deep dive into all this history and know it for your own. But the bottom line of it is this is how, in Netanyahu's words, this is how to thwart the creation of a Palestinian state in New York City, in Washington, in London, in Brussels, in Paris and Berlin, and in Tel Aviv. The liberals all want Israel to let the Palestinians go. Let them have an independent two-state. This is what they mean when they say two-state solution. Let them have an independent state on the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and with East Jerusalem as its capital. And then that would be the peace process. That was the promise of the Oslo peace process in the 1990s was it would culminate in a Palestinian state. Well, Netanyahu never favored that, and always he came in the first time in 1996. His whole plan was to do anything he could to thwart that peace process and thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state. And then that's his direct quote. Anyone who wishes to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state must support Hamas in Gaza. And he says that, yes, it's dangerous, and people criticize him for doing this because it's dangerous to support a terrorist group. But he says, don't worry, we control the height of the flame. And they denied that he said that because there were three different earball and eyeball witness sources who from his own Likud party that said he said that. And then he denied it and said, no, you're all liars. I didn't say that. Yeah. Well, now you can watch him say it with your own eyes and ears in Hebrew, and you can check the translation with your Israeli friend if you want. But it's a new documentary that came out called The Bibi Files. And there he is literally being interrogated by the National Police of Israel, the Shin Bet. They are interrogating Prime Minister Netanyahu. And they're saying, how could you support Hamas in the Gaza Strip? And he says, don't worry, I control the height of the flame. The exact same phrase. In other words, I know what I'm doing. Yes, I'm supporting horrible terrorists who would kill innocent civilians if they got the chance. But I'm doing that so that I can say to Washington and London and Tel Aviv liberals, forget you. You don't expect us to negotiate with terrorists like this, do you? You don't expect us to create a Palestinian state that's going to be run by Hamas when it's all a cheap excuse. They're the ones who propped up Hamas to rule over these poor people in the first place. And if you go back to Ariel Sharon's days in 2005, when they withdrew, so-called disengaged from the Gaza Strip, all they really did was move out to the prison walls, put the place under blockade and siege. And they explained at the time, people were attacking them saying, oh my God, you're giving land to the Palestinians. How dare you? And they said, that's not what we're doing. They said, what we're doing is we're putting the peace process in formaldehyde. We're freezing it. We're never going to have to negotiate giving up the West Bank and Gaza Strip and letting the Palestinians have their own state there because we have them successfully divided and conquered. And one of their advisors, his name was Dov Weissglass. He said, we put the peace process in formaldehyde. He says, we have a no one to talk to certificate from the US Congress. And it says there is no one to talk to, right? No partner for peace. And he says, and the certificate is good until Gaza becomes Norway. In other words, a peaceful, homogeneous Christian society with no threat of violence whatsoever. And then we'll have to negotiate with them. See you then, and shalom. Ha, 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 ha. So it's very
So,
simple. It's very simple.
okay.
How do you prevent the Palestinians from being able to legitimately say that, look, we have a responsible party in power. We can create a state. If you look at Mahmoud Abbas, Arafat's successor, and Fatah on the West Bank, you could argue that this guy could be trusted. Donald Trump says, oh, Mahmoud Abbas, he's a nice grandfatherly old figure. He could be okay, but not Hamas that controls the Gaza Strip. They're a bunch of terrorists. And because they're willing to kill civilians, because they are, in fact, they're not quite bin Ladenite radicals, but they are Islamists. They are in favor of enforcing Sharia law through their power and all of that. That as long as that's the case, the Israelis can point at them as scapegoats and say, you don't expect us to negotiate with terrorists like that, do you? And it's all deliberate. And then, so what happened on October the 7th? Netanyahu, his hubris caught up with him. I control the height of the flame. I know what I'm doing. But no, he didn't control the height of the flame. He didn't know what he was doing. And I think, a lot of people suspect, including even Charlie Kirk, suspected that Netanyahu had let the attack happen. Just like a lot of people suspected that Bush let 9/11 happen just so he could exploit it as badly as he did. But I don't make that case. I think that, in fact, what happened was word had gone up and down the chain of command in the Israeli security forces that if people lower down think that Hamas is training and practicing and they're about to do something, that don't put that word up through the chain of command because Netanyahu doesn't want to hear that he's wrong. And so if you say, "Oh my God, Hamas is training and it looks like they're preparing to break through the fence and do something crazy," and you report that to your captain, and your captain reports that to his lieutenant colonel is not even going to bother telling his colonel because he got chewed out last time because his colonel knows that the general's going to chew him out because Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't want to hear it that his brilliant plan isn't working. That in fact he doesn't control the height of the flame, and that in fact Hamas is dangerous and have not been successfully tamed. And so that the economics of Israeli security forces essentially have built into them to not pass adequate word up the chain of command about the danger, what people see unfolding in front of them. And so then they were caught with their pants down on a Saturday morning.
So let me ask you. So if Netanyahu knows that Netanyahu, according to what you said, knew that Hamas, they were terrorists. So that would make him just as complicit as the very terrorists that we point our fingers at when we say
That's what
that.
I'm saying.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Look, Israel controls the whole chessboard.